Okay, guys, welcome back to another video of the Alternate Future series. This is episode 2. In the last episode, we had Russia merging with Belarus, and Russia took over Ukraine and Georgia. And then over here in China, we can see that Korea got unified under democracy. And then we have India taking land from China and Pakistan. And then we have Taiwan being fully recognized as a country. And we have Indochina being formed, with Vietnam being the main country in power. So, in today's video, we're going to see what happens after these events. So, immediately, we can see that after a few years of peace, well, of what it, like, no wars in a while, I wouldn't say peace directly. We can see that a civil war breaks out. Tibet wants independence, and so does East Turkestan, Manchuria, and Tibet trying to get independence. Let's see how the civil war goes for the Chinese Communist Party. East Turkestan state is the East Turkestan state is pushing in a lot into the Chinese Communist Party, and China is not putting up a good fight right now until we see some bad news happening. Mongolia has joined the war against China, the Communist Party, so then they can get Inner Mongolia. They want Inner Mongolia, so they decide to invade it, and China cannot withstand the Mongolian troops coming in, as they're severely weakened from the war that had happened about like 2 to 3 years ago, which is only, so since it's only 2 to 3 years ago, it makes sense why they're pretty weak. And now we have Vietnam also trying to gang up on China, and they join the war, and so does Taiwan, and they're on the same side, so then they can get land for themselves. So immediately, it is not going well at all for China, as they're about to be consumed by all of their neighbors. Well, not all of them, but most of them. And it is not looking good for China, as they cannot withstand all of these troops coming into their country. And Taiwan has officially made their landing, and they cannot stop it, and they connect with Vietnam. And they start going in, and everything becomes worse for China. They cannot control the rebels, and they're being absolutely run over by Vietnam and Taiwan. Tibet is slowly pushing in, and they're not doing so good in the civil war, but they're still pushing. Mongolia is also trying to get stuff from East Turkestan, because they think that is our land, because we had it before, and it's part of Inner Mongolia, they say, and East Turkestan will not give it up. So Mongolia also invades into here, but as we can see, that they cannot withstand two fronts at once with the weak, well, compared to other countries, weak government that they have. So eventually China starts to step up their game and decide, okay, we're gonna go fully into Mongolia, as they had no business going into this civil war. So they decide, okay, time to push back the Mongolians, and let's go straight into Mongolia. So that's what they do. They go straight into Mongolia, and they're doing actually really well. But eventually, you can see that Mongolia cannot hold off China, and they're getting absolutely steamrolled out of here. And eventually, other fronts start going bad for them, as well as East Turkestan is also doing really well and starts pushing into Mongolia. It is not looking good for Mongolia at all in this Chinese Civil War. And we can see that Manchuria is also pushing in and back into Mongolia. Mostly because Korean and Japanese troops have actually come in to help them. But that also means that China is not going to have a fun time as well. And as we can see that China has officially lost access to the sea. And it's not going to look so good for them. As Mongolia tries to do a last-ditch effort, they start putting... Whoa. That was not supposed to happen. Manchuria did not conquer Mongolia yet. They decided to put fully force into trying to get the Chinese out. And they do, weakening the Chinese even more. And they start focusing on East Turkestan as well, which they push back mostly. They can't take out these two fronts right here as the troops are fighting for their lives. And we have tons of casualties happening. Like, lots of people are dying in these wars. And we can see that Mongolia has almost fully recaptured all their land except for these two areas. But eventually they start to do an encirclement movement. And they do that and they start succeeding. But then Mongolia decides to drop out of the war. But Manchuria and East Turkestan say, no, you're not. Because they need that land. They want that land back. So they decide to go in with all their might, trying to get all this land back. So they go in, and it is not going to go so well for Mongolia. Or is it? No, it isn't, as they start fighting. And Mongolia sees that they're not going to give up, so eventually they say, okay, we're going to leave the war. And they do leave the war. Eventually they leave the war. And people have called them cowards, but they have officially left the war, which leaves China in shambles. Basically, China's just left in shambles. And now everyone's focused on China except for Mongolia, which they left. Like, because most of them were focused on Mongolia, but now they're focused on China because, you know, Mongolia was actually doing pretty well considering that they're not really that strong. But China is now officially doomed, as Mongolia was their only hope of actually surviving, which was for the distraction. But now there's no country to distract them, and it's not going to end well for China. And eventually they surrender and they decide to draw borders with the rebel groups. In this peace treaty, we can say that East Turkestan and Tibet got released, and so did Manchuria. And then we see Mongolia expanding a little bit into China. And then we can see that Taiwan got some land over here in China. And then Indochina got these lands over here and got this island. Now, China still has access to the sea, but you're probably asking about this area. What is this area? So these are occupations. So Korea occupies this area, while Japan occupies this area. So, yeah. But those are only temporary. They're not going to be, like, forever. It's just only, like, occupations for, like, a short amount of time. You know, just to keep China in their place. And I'm pretty much sure they lost their capital, but correct me in the comments. I don't really know. Let me just look at a map real quick. So I checked, they did not lose Beijing, but Beijing is definitely surrounded. So, off to something else that's going to happen. What else is going to happen in this video today? So, next thing going to happen is we have the East African Federation being formed. And boom, the East African Federation is born. Now, next we are going to see what is happening in the Red Sea. I think this is the Red Sea. Yes, it is. I'm pretty much sure it is. But Egypt likes using this because of their canal and stuff, and it's very important for them. And it's also for Sudan. But then Ethiopia announces that, hey, Djibouti, can we like pass through you, or else you're gonna get invaded? And Djibouti says, okay, sure, sure. And then they start using the Red Sea for themselves, and they blockade it off. So that means they're the only ones who can use it without it being cut off. And Egypt does not take this lightly. And they do not take it lightly at all that they officially declare war onto Ethiopia. Because apparently they say that's not really fair, and you can't do that. You just can't do that. I'm sorry, you can't do that, Ethiopia. We're gonna have to teach you a lesson. And then Ethiopia is actually allied with the East African Federation, and they joined because, South Sudan does not like Sudan for reasons. And we have actually Eritrea being on the red side, mainly because they were bribed by Sudan and said, okay, we'll give you territories from Ethiopia if you join. Somalia hears this as well, and they're like, okay, yeah, can we also get territories? And then Sudan says, okay, yeah, sure. And then we have Djibouti being completely invaded by Ethiopia before anyone can even react, and they're just immediately invaded. Okay, well, then something I have to mention, is that we have Somaliland. So what do we do about Somaliland? Of course we're gonna show it on the map. That was like technically they exist, but technically they don't. But they're there. So the war has officially started, and the troops are now assembling. So immediately we have Sudan invading the East African Federation, mainly the South Sudan part. I'm just going to say South Sudan because it's easier to say than East African Federation every single time. Or the EAF, which doesn't sound better either, so I'm just going to call it by like which country they're actually invaded. And not just as one whole, even though like they're all autonomous states and they're all one country, but I don't want to say that because it's too long of a name. Anyways, and Sudan also invades in Ethiopia, and these fronts are going really well. And Eritrea is also doing well in Ethiopia, and they also invade most of Djibouti, not all of it though. And let's see what's happening in Somaliland. So in Somaliland, we have them touching this side of the coast. They also occupy this island as well that belongs to Somalia for some reason. And they keep going into Somalia, and Somalia finds itself isolated as it's invaded by Kenya and Ethiopia, with no help being able to be sent to them because, they're basically on opposite sides and they're not connected. So Somalia is completely captured. And then we have Somaliland and Ethiopia trying to get back Djibouti, which they do. And then they start invading Eritrea up here, which makes this front start to collapse. Well, like, this front is not really going well anymore. And the troops start retreating into Eritrea. And we see Eritrea not doing so well, as they're looking like this right now, and they're cut off. And then they barely survive, as then Sudan sends tons of troops to make a stalemate across the border, which basically contains all of occupied lands of Sudan, and then along this border of Ethiopia, this very short border, and then the occupied lands of Sudan that is occupied by Ethiopia, and then back to the border, and then back to here. You can see that, and then so yeah, but eventually Eritrea surrenders, and now Ethiopia is fully invading Sudan from this side, and Egypt is sending as many troops as they can to do this. But then Israel sees this and says, hey, we have a chance. We have a chance. So they join the war. Israel joins the war while they're fighting Palestine. They join the war, and Egypt is not prepared for this, as we have the peninsula being completely captured. And eventually Ethiopia is able to push back a little bit, and they push Sudan all the way out of their country and start helping on the front of South Sudan, the South Sudan part, of EAF. And then we have them invading Sudan by from all fronts, and it's not looking too good for Sudan right now. And if we look at Sudan from afar, yeah, it's not going so good. And then we have a rebel group standing up, and they start declaring independence, and they even go into Egypt. Sudan is forced to surrender to the blue team, and Egypt is forced to also surrender as well. So let's look at this peace treaty. Looking at this peace treaty, we can see that the East African Federation got some land from Sudan, and then Ethiopia got Eritrea, Djibouti, and Somalia. And Somaliland got released and got some land, only minor land though. And Ethiopia also got land from Sudan, and then we have the rebel group getting independence, which means Sudan loses access to the Red Sea. And then Egypt loses their peninsula thing. Now Israel has it, which means I think they actually lose the canal. That means, yeah, they definitely do lose the canal, which that means they're both very weakened. But that is it for this video of the alternate future series. Guys, like and subscribe if you like this episode. Make sure to check out the third episode when you're notified. And see you guys in the next one. Peace. Also, put your suggestions of what to happen next in the next episode. Bye bye.